Hi everyone, welcome. I'm Annalisa from C.A.C. Global Solutions. We're aircraft management specialists, and today's interview is a very special one, and it's about the aircraft certification process. Today's guest is Adam Bakos. Adam is a professional engineer with 15 years of experience in the aerospace industry, predominantly in the areas of airworthiness procedures and processes, aircraft type certification, product integrity, project management, and international regulatory affairs. Adam was formerly a senior engineering specialist, technical expert, and section team lead of the Airworthiness Department of the Global Aircraft Platform at Bombardier in Toronto. Adam is currently a project certification manager at Transport Canada Civil Aviation, National Aircraft Certification Branch. Adam joined us in this interview as an aircraft certification and international regulatory affairs expert, and he shared with us some of what he has learned about aircraft certification. Some of the topics we discussed are the role of the TC holder, the different phases of the certification process, and the authority roles, how different authorities issue their own TCDS, what service bulletins are, how they come to be, and much more. We'd like to thank Adam for sharing his knowledge and his time with us. It's a lengthy interview, but full of good content that we're sure a lot of aviation professionals with different backgrounds and involved in different branches of aviation are going to appreciate and enjoy. We're grateful to have had the opportunity to have this conversation, and we look forward to many more. Let us know your thoughts, leave a comment, and enjoy, and thanks for watching. Hi everyone, welcome. It's Annalise and Brett from C.A.C. Global Solutions. We are here today for another episode of our podcast, Aviation Perspectives with C.A.C. And we are going to talk to Adam Bakos today. Adam, thank you so much for joining us and for your time.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy you reached out, and I look forward to talking about a very, very vast topic in the aviation world.
Yeah, this is going to be a good one. So I'd like to start with you. So who is Adam, and what do you do in aviation?
That's that's a good question. So I think of myself, I guess, in a number of different ways. So I'm a dedicated engineer. I think of myself as a servant leader. I do a lot of volunteer work. I'm an educator. I'm a lecturer. I teach aircraft certification at Toronto Metropolitan University. Um, and you know, I got into aircraft certification, I guess, not by chance, but unexpectedly, and I was very lucky to find out that I really enjoy it. I excel in it. It's something that really fits my personality. I've had a number of different aspects in it. I started as an intern in project management, so I like to use those skills as well. But yeah, I think probably the best descriptors would be um, servant leader and volunteer.
Wow. Okay.
So you work also in both in or you have worked in industry, but also on the regulatory side as well, right?
Correct. Yeah, I spent the better part of 13 years at Bombardier, um, and the last 2 years I've spent now at Transport Canada as a project certification manager. I finished my role at Bombardier as a senior engineering specialist or technical expert, um, and um, and part of certification, airworthiness. I look at it as also mixed in with kind of like technical project management as well.
Okay. So how did you start though? I mean, did you go to a specific school? It is something that a dream of yours? Everybody is fascinated with aviation since we all are, since we are little kid.
Yeah,
It was your case?
yeah, it's very true. I guess I have a unique well, maybe not unique. Maybe maybe a lot of people get into it this way. So I've kind of always been around mechanical and technical things all my life. My grandfather was a mechanic, and every weekend we go to his shop. Um, and although I'm not the most technically inclined, that definitely sparked something in me. My dad actually is in the 1980s. When he finished school, he wanted to be a pilot, but the economy wasn't good. There were no pilot jobs, so he became a mechanical engineer. But he got his PPL. He got all his ratings, IFR, multi-engine, commercial, all the stuff. And when we were kids, I remember 6, 7, 8 years old, we would go flying with him on, Cessna 172s, 175s, Piper Cherokees, Piper Seminoles. And, so I think it's a combination of, my dad did mechanical engineering, and I was around airplanes from a very young age. We went to air shows. We would go to the C&E air show here in Toronto. We would drive out to Trenton. We went out to London a couple of times as well. I don't even know if they still have that air show. But anyways, I remember as a kid, and I've always been interested in military aircraft and kind of a, amateur historian. Um, but so we're always around airplanes, and I just like airplanes. And then, when the time came to go to school, I'm like, okay, well, I'm good at math and science and physics. Well, what can I do? And then I was like, yeah, but is there a way I can mix it with airplanes? And then, I found, oh, there was an aerospace program here in Toronto, and a couple of my good friends were going into it as well. So but back in those days, it was named Ryerson, and coincidentally, both my mother and father, they both went there. My mom did nursing, my dad did mechanical, and so I did aerospace, and that's kind of, I guess, how it started.
Oh, wow.
That's quite interesting.
Yeah.
So Ryerson is home for the three of you then.
Yeah, it is, and it's funny because because of my work in aircraft certification, and my former manager, before he retired, he helped set up the aircraft certification course at now named Toronto Metropolitan, and I've been very lucky that I've been able to take it over, and I was involved with it basically from the beginning. I did guest lecturing for years, but now, yeah, the last 5 years I've been leading it. So when I go back to school, it's like I have all those memories of me
Uh,
going down the hallway, rushing to a class, or getting ready for the dreaded exams, and
Yeah.
now I'm the one giving out the exams.
Oh, that's good. Well, it gives you that perspective on what they're experiencing, kind of going down the same path you did, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's a graduate level course, but it's a spectrum of people. It's you know people who've gone through to continue their education straight out of their bachelors. It's people who are coming back to school, people who are in industry. I mean,
Mm,
this year actually, I'm very happy. It's a good cross section, and they're very engaged, and it makes it as enjoyable for me to have that kind of feedback, and
Mm.
answer those questions, and make the students think. But yeah, I remember sitting in those chairs, and I tell them, that they're very lucky that I would have wanted a professor like me when I was going to school.
Yeah, I think I know what you mean. I had one or two that, yeah, it just didn't go the way I thought it would, but yeah, it all worked
But
out.
but no, it's great, and it's also great to help educate the next generation of engineers coming up.
Oh, for
yeah.
sure, for sure. And I'm suspecting because they've all signed up for this, they're all quite interested in what they're doing, and they all have different reasons for being there, I suspect.
Oh yeah, completely. Some, they have no idea what it's about, and they're just interested in the topic. Sometimes I do get a student who knows a little bit about things, and they kind of want to expand their knowledge. So yeah, it's a really good cross section of often have people in automotive field or mechanical and aerospace, and it's a good mix too, because then it creates kind of a um, a unique atmosphere in the class where
Mhm.
it's different perspectives. People don't know what they don't know, so they give
Mhm.
different perspectives based on their history or their education or their background or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So how what attracted you to this to begin with?
Well, it's funny because I started as a kind of a project management intern after I did my bachelor's. I didn't want to stop school, but I wasn't set on doing a master's degree yet. So I went back and did some project management, and that's actually what enabled me to get the internship at Bombardier in the project management department. And I was there for a year. I done a full summer, and then I stayed on part time, and they couldn't keep me on. But I had started to make connections within the airworthiness and certification group. And being honest, I didn't know much. I knew a couple of acronyms, and as a student, you're like trying to get a job. There's that aspect. Um, and it was a tough environment. I was going to many engineering functions. I had started in Ontario at that time. They had the EIT, the Engineering Intern Training Program, um, which they're now looking at revamping. But and then I was working to get my professional engineer designation. So there's a lot going on, and I really wanted to stay, and I really liked the company, and thankfully that department, they were kind of rebuilding, and I interviewed and I got the job. But like I said, truthfully, I didn't know much, but I loved it. It's funny if you ask my friends or family, they're for sure they'll tell you, no, Adam's a rule guy, or Adam's all about processes and procedures, and it's really funny because that kind of permeates my life, and now it's become my career,
Mhm.
and I really took to it, and I was very lucky that I had management who was supportive, and I had my former manager who retired, who was a mentor, and I was able to learn, and then I just said, yeah, yeah, I want to do this. I want to learn everything there is to know about the aircraft certification process. And then I put all my effort into it, and then, like I said, when I left Bombardier, I was a senior engineering specialist, technical expert, and I've been able to use those skills in a variety of ways. I was an instructor at Bombardier. I'm an instructor now for the university, and now working at Transport Canada. I've been able to use that knowledge on the different projects to which I work, and so yeah, it's been a unique evolution. But once I got into it, I was like, yeah, I really like this, and the
Mhm.
interesting thing is a lot of people don't know about it. Like, if you're in the industry, okay, I have to certify, but like some people see this as kind of like a black box. So it's always nice to sit down and go, no, 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 here's how it works.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, for
So
sure.
it's been great to share that knowledge.
Right. Well, I have to say also, I mean, we've had dealings before, you and I, and I myself from the regulator's perspective, and yourself when you were with Bombardier, and even to this day, there's more to just the specialist activity that you're involved in. There's a professionalism about you, and this is one of the things that I appreciate, because well, as a regulator, if I contacted you, I got immediate response. I got to the point where I got turned on to somebody that could help me out if it wasn't your area. And even
Mhm.
today, when we contact you, it's so nice. It's refreshing to get a fairly quick response, and it's just
Mhm.
it's a breath of fresh air, really, in the industry, because I find so many people hide behind their emails and texts and everything else today, and it's hard to pin some people down on certain things.
Yeah, I would agree. And one thing I learned very young, especially in a role, if you're in certification or international regulatory affairs, is it's really about people and about relationships and how do you get things done. And you have to build rapport. And throughout the majority of my career, actually, most of it, other than in my immediate team, when I was a team lead, I never had any authority over, kind of the people or the work that we were doing. It was always, I need someone else to do something so that I can do my job.
Yeah.
And then it's like, well, how do you do that? How, and that becomes a skill, you know, you know, dealing with people and going through those challenges, or um, I, I think it's called like influencing others, those kind of skills that are really kind of paramount in this industry, especially. um, and that's it. And what I've always learned is, absolutely be responsive. I mean, you want to literally treat someone how you want to be treated. If I'm looking, to someone to get an approval, or my past life, if we're looking to do a foreign validation to a foreign country, you know, I need to be responsive because that's my project. So
Right.
Mhm.
Right. Sure.
Yeah, and everything in aviation is time sensitive. Everybody wants things for yesterday, right?
yeah,
So
yesterday. That's one thing with aviation. It's yeah, time can be the time crunch is real.
yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, so we dig into the technical stuff. Okay, so the first question is, what's the general process for obtaining type certification for an aircraft?
So I'm not gonna I'm not gonna bore you with all the certification details, but suffice it to say, the process, thankfully, throughout the world is pretty consistent. There are differences here and there, but from a Canadian perspective, we look to our CAR 521, and we look to the aircraft certification process. So, the conclusion of the aircraft certification process is, um, well, and I shouldn't just say aircraft, I should more say aeronautical product,
Right.
because it's not just aircraft, it's engines, it's propellers, it's, rotorcraft. Um, but, um, we have the four phases of certification: establishing the certification basis, agreeing in means and method of compliance, and agreeing on LOI. Then we have demonstration of compliance. Then we have certifying a type design. Of course, there is a fifth phase, which is post-type cert activities and foreign validation. But, you know, to your point, how do we get a type certificate? Well, it's at the end of that fourth phase. That really is okay, here's the type certificate for the aeronautical product. Here's the TCDS for the aeronautical product. And, depending on that product, it's years of work. For aircraft, it can be, 5, 6+ years pre-cert. And then, in the certification timeline for an aircraft, for example, is 5 years through that process, all those phases. Or for an engine, for example, it's 3 years. So that will culminate in the issuance of the type certificate there at the end.
Right. So I mean, that was a quite a high level, and understandably, I mean, there's so many aspects to it. But I'm just curious. Like, we're curious, I think, about when we think about the process, as a layman coming and looking at this, and we're looking at offering different perspectives. So we try to focus on our audiences may not understand what the certification process is. But as somebody, say I want to design an aircraft, I've been
Mhm.
building something, I think I've got it figured out. And
Right.
so the first step in this case, I would go to the regulator that's responsible for the state that I live in, right?
Right.
So in this case, it would be Transport Canada.
Right.
So I would approach Transport Canada certification. That's the group that you're with, right? At
Yes.
this time.
National
And
Aircraft Safety.
and I would submit an application. I guess the whole concept is I have something that I think is an acceptable design that I
Yeah.
want to obtain an approval for, right?
Right.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, if we want to kind of go back to first principles. So yeah, I guess it really depends. So technically, well, not technically, I work for National Aircraft Certification, which is headquartered in Ottawa, and they really look after kind of the big applicants. Um, and the regions are looking at smaller projects, STC projects,
Right.
supplemental type
Okay.
certificate projects, mods, repairs, those kind of things. But yeah, if we want to kind of start from a first principle and say, okay, I want to make an airplane, or I want to make a product, how do I go about doing it? the first thing would be the technical capability test. So, there's CAR 521 is clear, how you make an application, when you can make an application, what that application has to contain. But also, as part of that, as an organization, you have to have the technical capability to engage in those, certification activities and engage in, getting services with essentially Transport Canada. And yeah, and essentially that's how it would go. It would be like, okay, I want to bring a new product to market. I either have delegates or, I have a small DAO or whatever it is, or I've been granted a DAO. And, I now have the technical capability to be able to actually take on this endeavor. And then, I would follow the process, make that application. You start to engage with Transport Canada. You start to provide technical information. And then, you enter those phases. And mind you, like I said, it was high level, but yeah, that's kind of how you would start. Yeah, it's you just can't. Yeah, I mean, there are home builds and things like that. But if you actually want to build a product, mass produce it, you have to
Right.
follow that process of
So I'm curious, when you talked about the test of whether you have the capability or not, does that include being able to support the aircraft after production?
well, see, that's the thing too, is so it's not just about building a product. It's also about, if you're going to be a type certificate holder, you have certain responsibilities. You have responsibilities for that aircraft being in service, to look at deficiencies, you know, continued airworthiness, instructions for continued airworthiness. What are the maintenance procedures? What system do you have in place if there are reported difficulties? How are you as a type certificate holder going to address them? What's the system in place to impart, modifications and get manuals out there and those kind of things. So there are a lot of responsibilities for a type certificate holder, that it's not just, yeah, I build a product, it goes out there and I walk away. Essentially it's a cradle to grave process. And as long as you're the holder of that type certificate, you're responsible for it. And it doesn't happen often. But like, for example, when Bombardier sold off different parts of um, uh, its business units, they became their own DAOs. There had to be a type certificate transfer so that those organizations now take responsibility for not just the building of that product if they're still manufacturing it, or um, but and also, its continued life cycle, maintenance, updated procedures, instructions for continued airworthiness, and those type of things. So, and one thing I tell my students is, aerospace is a very expensive business, and it's not just the startup costs or getting the capital to build the product, but it literally is to keep that product flying for, to get the return on investment. It's likely decades.
Right.
Um, and then of course new products will come out and there'll be design changes and there'll be advancements. But as long as you have that product on your type certificate, then you're responsible for it.
Can I think for me this would be a good point to ask this question. Um, a lot of people that are in industry struggle with the difference between the concept of type certificate holder and manufacturer. Can you just touch on that a little bit? The differences between the two.
Yeah, sure. So um, the way I describe it is, you have your paper process, and you have your paper airplane, and you have your physical airplane. And the type certification process, TCDS, definition of certified aircraft, that's all paper process. That's all paper airplane. But the actual manufacturing, the build, conformance to the type design, that's physical airplane. And two have to go hand in hand. But essentially, um, there's, what I was involved with was that kind of paper airplane process, that's the type certification. But just having that doesn't mean that I can build an airplane. That's okay. I have a design and it's certified. what people don't realize is, well, as that's happening in parallel, an organization, an OEM, they're also trying to get a manufacturing approval. And they might be building airplanes as they're kind of doing this parallel activity. And it's like, okay, once I get my type certificate and then I get my manufacturing certificate, now I can start to, C of A these airplanes to get the certificate of airworthiness. But that's kind of where the two come together there, is at the end. But they are two parallel paths. And yes, like I said, I focus on the paper airplane process as part of certification, but there's equally as thorough and process and to get a manufacturing approval that an organization has to do. And then once they get that manufacturing approval, then it's like, okay, then we can keep building this product. And there's a different part of Transport Canada that will of course certify or approve on the manufacturing side. And then the two together, once I have my type approval and I've got my manufacturing approval, now I can start to get C of A's, because airworthiness of an aircraft is determined on three things, what I call a three-legged stool. The aircraft is safe and fit for flight and in conformance with its type design. That means that it's built, to the spec. And that's where you need that manufacturing approval, those manufacturing processes and those quality processes in place, so that if anything goes wrong with the aircraft in production, that they can bring the aircraft back to blueprint, and that matches, that conforms the aircraft, that matches the type certification, and therefore you can then get a C of A at the end, because that's what you want. You can't fly an airplane unless it has a C of A.
Right, right. No, just one of the aspects that I always find curious is and I think some people don't quite get, is a manufacturer can be completely independent from the type certificate holder as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, not in my experience, but yes, it could be. I mean, the other thing is too, because I was always dealing with the type certification world, but if you're looking at, for example, the supplemental type certification world, yes, there are OEMs that may have an organization that does supplemental type certificate approvals, but some might not. And there are a lot of third-party organizations out there where, they can take that airplane and get that fitted with certain mods or certain changes or whatever they want to do. And then that organization is the holder of that, type design, albeit, supplemental.
Right. In a case like that, the holder, the owner of the data, the type certificate holder, they would have to, uh, under some sort of agreement, license or sale of, like you say, an STC. That would be the permission for the end user to use that and embody it into their aircraft, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. There's obviously a lot of commercial agreements that are out there, and exactly, because the holder of that data is responsible. And if, let's say you go to a third party, that third party holds that data, but now you need to go back to the OEM. Well, you need to get that data. Okay. Well, then, as the operator, you're like, well, I may have to, I need to facilitate an agreement if I need to go back to the OEM to understand what the STC holder did, because the OEM, as the type certificate holder, doesn't get access to that STC, and rightfully so. That organization, undoubtedly, they want to they want to make money. That's what they're in business for. So yeah, there's those kind of agreements have to happen, or exactly, if another organization is doing the manufacturing or doing the STCs, there would be some kind of commercial arrangement to say, okay, well, if I need this data for this purpose, then then it's chargeable, or we have a relationship. And the OEMs work in the same way. They have all this, this data, these AFM supplements, all this capability. It depends on what the operator wants. Do they need everything? Do they want everything? But if they want something that's not in the, say, baseline configuration, well, then it's going to cost them money to upgrade their product.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So how the authority fits in all of this, in these 4 phases of certification?
So you really can't do it without the authority. That's how the system is set up. So you go back in Canada anyway to the Aeronautics Act. So the Aeronautics Act gives the Minister of Transport in Canada the authority to create regulations and to delegate his or her authority. Specifically looking at the regulation side, you know, the regulations have been created. And, when I say the Minister of Transport, Transport Canada administers that work on behalf of the Minister of Transport. I make the joke, it's not like the poor Minister of Transport sitting there trying to, do all the approvals for all these different companies. I need a new rivet type, and they're, the minister's trying to do the approval. It doesn't work like that. Transport Canada represents the minister, and um, at least in that capacity. And if you're going to get anything done, it has to be through, in our case, Transport Canada. And FAA, EASA are set up the same way. If you want to do an aeronautical product, to follow the process, you need to engage with the authorities. So they're really kind of the first step. And even when you have a certified type design, that relationship doesn't end. If you want to put your product in another jurisdiction, like a foreign validation, for example, then your certifying authority is the gateway to the other countries. You go through your certifying authority to the foreign validating authority as a point of contact. And so really the relationship with the authority, the National Civil Aviation Authority, it doesn't end. You're always dealing with them in some capacity. Some organizations, they don't have delegation. And that means that, Transport Canada has to do approvals on their behalf. Organizations that have delegation, they can do the approvals, but Transport Canada has oversight. Transport Canada is involved in auditing of their organization. Or, many organizations, they can't approve, for example, approved manuals, like AFMs, those kind of, approved manuals, capital, as I call them, capital A approved manuals, something that is in the type certificate data sheet. So you have to go back to the authority to go get those approvals. So yes, it's a very symbiotic relationship. And rightfully so. It's not just, hey, we want to build a product, Transport Canada, you do what you need to do, and then we go on our merry way. It's a joint, it's a joint effort, and it's about shared responsibility. It's about safety being paramount, but how do both sides are looking for different things. How do we make sure that the product is still safe when it goes out there?
So earlier on, you mentioned when dealing with the regulator, part of the certification process is the LOI. So this is where the LOI is a level of involvement document, right? And this is where any type certificate or potential type certificate holder and the regulator would get together and they would discuss the terms of, okay, what needs to be done for first. They have a project outline, and then they determine, depending on who the type certificate holder is and what the history is with the type certificate holder, what level of involvement the regulator has to have, at what intervals they'll come in, what phases, and they'll discuss what needs to be done on both parties' behalf as the project progresses, right?
Yeah, and it's even a little bit more than that too. It's the level of involvement is to oversee the work, whether it's a delegate, a DAR in Canada, a design approval representative, or it's an authorized person in a DAO. Yes, the DAO is the delegate, but there's a relationship, back and forth between the counterpart and the TC specialist. And an LOI can differ, and it can change and evolve throughout a project. If you've maybe got a newer organization, or you have something that's maybe more novel or higher risk, there might be more involvement of the authority in that, because just by the nature of what that activity or product is. But if you're dealing with maybe a more experienced delegate, or an organization that's been around for a long time, and there's a lot of history, and there's a lot of trust, and the work maybe is not as new and novel or is as risky, then Transport Canada can say, okay, I can pull back on some of that involvement. So it really is, actually there is a staff instruction on it. It is really project dependent and applicant dependent. But that's why it's there. It gives some flexibility to say, okay, maybe we focus more on this area. Because again, you have to realize the companies that are building the products, the regulatory authorities, there are not unlimited budgets. And, there's always resource constraints in personnel, in budgets. So the question is, you really want to focus in on areas, not the areas that are run of the mill, not going to have a problem. You really want to focus on the areas of higher risk or potential something newer or novel, and that's where you tend to see very specific focus when it comes to LOI. And like I said, it can evolve. If things are going really well in a project or a design, things might be really high at the beginning, and as confidence is built and a relationship is built between Transport Canada counterparts and or in our case, but any other authority and the applicant or the applicant's representative, then then LOI can potentially be reduced as the project moves on.
Right, but I mean, like you say, it's all project based, and the converse could hold true as well, where it could be the type certificate holder's intent to manage the entire project because they have the capability, but all of a sudden resources are strained and they have to farm something out to third party. Well, that may change the oversight that the regulator wants to conduct on the whole project, right?
Completely, yeah. I mean, if you have to all of a sudden start using contracted individuals or another third party that maybe there isn't as much relationship with, then exactly, then the LOI can go up, and there's more involvement because you want to make sure, as a certifying authority, that the work that the authorized person is doing is what needs to be done. So yeah, it's oversight in a different way.
So I'm curious, if I want to come up with a complete different design, something completely new, I suppose there is going to be the need for a new requirements, a new rules. So I suppose that these new rules would be developed between, again, the TC holder and the authority over time, over a lot of data tests and stuff like that.
So there's a couple of aspects to what you raised. So I was mentioning CAR 521. That's a regulation.
21.
Yeah, how to. It's really the what, if we want to say that. It's the what the applicant needs to do if they want to have an aeronautical product.
Mm-hmm.
The second part, kind of what you're getting at, is the how. So okay, I now have this aeronautical product. Well, what is it, and what box does it fit into?
Mm-hmm.
So in the Canadian framework, there's what we call the Airworthiness Manual, and that's where the standards or requirements are kept. And we have 522, AWM 523, AWM 525, 527, 529. So those are small light aircraft. There's general aviation aircraft. There's what most people are familiar with, large transport category aircraft, which is the Part 25. In Canada, we call it AWM 525, but ostensibly it's the same thing. There are, of course, differences, a handful of differences. And then in Part 27, 29, we talk about rotorcraft, and there's all those standards. So if the product that you're going to build, fits into one of those categories, then no problem. It's there. It's these are what you need to follow. You have an engine, it's Part 33, or it's, in the FAA world, or in Canada, it's AWM 533, and yes, it's CS engine. But to your, I guess, last part is, well, what happens if there's a product that doesn't meet those boxes nicely? Well, thankfully, there is provision within CAR 521 that says that if there is no pure standard, then a combination of standards can be used. So it's not like the first thing is immediately we need to go out and create new standards. Thankfully, because that's a very time-consuming and intensive process. So that absolutely could be done. You know, and EASA does that very well. FA does it fairly well as well. Transport Canada is more involved in a lot of the working groups that help guide and shape those policies, and then Transport Canada adopts a lot of them. But yeah, so essentially you're completely right. You either have to go out and create new requirements, or like I said, there is a mechanism within our CAR 521 which says, well, you can pick from the existing requirements as you would see fit to satisfy what that product is doing. And then, of course, there's the mechanism of what we call special conditions, which are for anything that's new and novel. You would put a special condition, you would have a special condition on it, and you know the requirements can be listed in there for what the product would need to meet.
So I'm just curious. So for special conditions, I'm thinking back to I had involvement with the Boeing 737 Max, and with the whole new concept of the aircraft being controlled by computer. There was a whole issue with the FAA. They had special requirements of some sort where the handling of the software, the handling of the computer being used to update the aircraft itself, there were no rules for that, and so the FAA came up with a set of special rules for the safeguarding of that and the process of it. Is that something that Transport Canada would issue a special condition on?
Yeah, so essentially, if it meets that criteria, there you go. It has no existing requirements,
Right.
you know, or it's a new or novel technology, and so the only way in the certification process to capture something like that is, well, then we need to kind of create project specific or applicant specific or design specific requirements for that product, and the vehicle for that would be a special condition. Yes.
Right. Okay. And also, I'm a little curious. The term change product rule rather. Can you just explain what that is a little bit?
I probably could talk your ear off, actually. I in my past life, I was actually a CPR authorized person at Bombardier, I think for 5 or 6 years, and part of some working groups. But yeah, so I mean, if you'll indulge the instructor in me, we'll go back a little bit. So before change product rules CPR came out, there really was no mechanism for the authorities to make an applicant have newer standards or use newer standards, and I say that because the whole purpose of having updated requirements standards is an evolution of, well, it gets safer and safer as you go. You know, things happen in aviation, we find out what caused the problem and we change it, you know, and the rule changes, and you know the rules evolve. But now we're at a point where, you know, you're not seeing as many aviation incidents. You know, yeah, you know, there's a lot of stuff in the media, but writ large, you know, you don't see the problems that you saw in aviation, let's say in the 1970s or 1980s, because you know the requirements are much more evolved and they're much more stringent. Well, there was no mechanism to force an applicant to say update your certification basis. And if I was building a product from the 1960s or 1970s, and all of a sudden I'm doing design changes or product evolution in the 1990s or 2000s, why would I want to have a newer cert basis? Because it makes things more expensive. It's, you know, newer findings of compliance. It's more work. It's more effort. So there was no real mechanism to do that, and the industry didn't want to do it, and it was like the authorities were trying to pull the applicants kicking and screaming to have newer requirements. So finally, the world kind of got together and through a series of meetings, working groups in the late 1990s, with the culmination, I think, in 2000 or 2001. I'd have to check my notes, but with the introduction of CPR, which was, okay, that's it. the applicants, we're not gonna drag you kicking and screaming. The baseline is now, if you're going to do a design change, you have to meet the newest regulations. And if you're not going to, you have to justify to us why you can meet the earlier. So it flipped everything on its head. And pretty much, you know, the majority of the aviation world works by this rule. And you know, there are advisory circulars out there on it that explain the process. I'm not gonna, you know, go into all the gritty details, but suffice it to say that if an applicant is going to do a design change, they are going to have to meet the newer standards unless they can justify not. And there is a scope of changes that, you know, the wonderful thing about the advisory circular is there's a bunch of examples that industry and the authorities got together back in 2000 or whenever it was finalized, that said, well, if I do changes of this size and scope, which are like the most common changes that OEMs would do for all the aeronautical products, there's you know, CPR has looked at engines, aircraft, rotorcraft, you know, it's all there. Then we don't need to change our certification basis, or you can make the argument that the existing certification basis is sufficient. But if I essentially break a threshold, then I need to pick up the newest requirements in that area of change. So not necessarily, you know, if I'm doing a whole new aircraft, well, then it's a new type certificate. But if I'm doing a design change, a change to the type certificate, then I look at that area of change and I have to look at, okay, well, what are the newer requirements in that area, or have the requirements changed? And if they have, then I'm obligated to meet them. If I can argue as an applicant, I don't need to meet them, and here's why, then, you know, the authority will take that into consideration. But that's just a proposal. That doesn't mean that that's the way it's going to be. So CPR really changed things, and it put the onus on the applicant to justify why they didn't need to meet newer standards, and then, you know, essentially there becomes an agreement. Either yes, you can use your existing certification basis, or at the conclusion, okay, yes, you do have to, because of the size and scope of the change you're doing, you do have to increase your certification basis, and these are the requirements now that you have to pick up that are at a newer amendment level. And that would be written into your type certificate data sheet. So for that area, you have you have a higher certification basis than the rest of your aircraft.
Okay.
And from hence,
Yeah.
and the whole thing is, you know, it's like henceforth, you know, from that time on, you know, the work that you do in that area now always set the new baseline is those higher standards.
Right. Yeah,
That's
for sure.
fascinating.
It is. I mean, this kind of side note, but this reminds me of some of the older aircraft, like some of the older de Havillands that are built to Car 3 or Car 4 or whatever, and now all of a sudden they're 523 or 525 or FAR 23 or FAR 25.
Yeah, you know, if they're doing all kinds of modifications to the product, you know, those old standards are just not going to cut it. So, you know, are they going to go get a new type certificate? Then you got to essentially rebuild the aircraft from the ground up, or yeah, you're picking up these newer standards, but you can. And again, there's a negotiation. The goal of the authorities are not to stifle development or improvement, or they don't want to see projects fail, but also there needs to be a balance of risk and safety. And, you know, you need to find that kind of middle ground, so that, you know, the product is safe, and the design change on the product is safe, and you know, and there's kind of a structure around it, and CPR, you know, has done a good job for, you know, a few decades now, and you know, there's going to be an evolution of CPR as well as time goes on, but, you know, that's just, you know, how aviation works.
Right.
I look forward when we will be able to fly Vancouver, Milano, Italy in 2 hours. Done. Boom.
Well, you know, they're looking at bringing supersonic aircraft back, so
Yeah. Okay, so one thing about TCDS and TC holder, can you talk about how different state TCDS come to be?
So when you certify an aircraft, you're certifying it with your national civil aviation authority. But as an aircraft manufacturer, again, I'm not speaking on behalf of an aircraft manufacturer. I'm just, hypothesizing on why, but it kind of makes sense. You're building a product to make money. So how am I going to get my product out there into different jurisdictions? Well, the only way I can do that is by doing foreign validations. So some jurisdictions accept whatever National Civil Aviation Authority certificate that you have. Maybe there's a paperwork exercise and that's the conclusion of it. But some authorities do more thorough review, or they do, quite, like a full-blown, validation activity. And what ends up happening is the culmination of that ends up in it's a validated type certificate. So that foreign civil aviation authority will then issue their own TC and TCDS for your aeronautical product. So what I talk to my students about is that uh, to put your product in another jurisdiction, it's a privilege, not a right. There's nothing that says, oh, absolutely, this country has to take my product. It doesn't work like that, right? But if you do all the work and you understand what they're looking for, and their process is similar to the process that you use to certify in your national authority, then it will culminate in the issuance of a foreign type certificate and a foreign TCDS. But yeah, just because you build a product does not mean all of a sudden every country in the world is going to start issuing you TCDSs. Like I said, it varies. Some countries are paperwork exercise. Because you have TC or FA or YASA, okay, you're automatically accepted. Some countries require a thorough review, and you go through that exercise, and it could take 6 months, 8 months, a year, 16 months exercise, and then that will culminate in that foreign authority issuing you their own version of the TCDS for your product, and then that will enable you to, get registration in that country.
Right. So you touched on a point there that I like to expand on sometimes, and that is the the idea that there's no obligation by another state to even entertain the idea of type certificate approval. Whereas uh, if you're designing something, if you're making an application in the state in which you're a citizen of, basically, like in this instance, Transport Canada would be obligated to process an application, maybe not approve it, but at least entertain the application, right? Whereas a foreign state wouldn't even be obligated to even entertain the idea if they felt it wasn't in their interest.
Exactly. And some countries are very open, and if they have a good relationship with your certifying authority or the OEM, for example, and it's a paperwork exercise, they don't mind doing it. But you raise a really good point: is there's nothing obligating another civil aviation authority to do that. And in the end, if they are an authority that requires a more thorough review, then that's taxpayer dollars, because most of these civil aviation authorities are funded by the taxpayer base in that country. They will not launch a project unless they know that that country is going to benefit in some way. So often, in my past life, until we had a letter of sale, or there was the contract was signed, and then you could go to the authority and they would say, okay, now we'll start the work, because they know one of their citizens has bought this product, and then we'll be bringing it here, and then they have to do the work. But some authorities, yeah, unless that happens, they're not going to do the work, because that's time, effort, money that is not benefiting their country as yet, because there's no guarantee that that product is going to be there, it's going to be operating there, that the person who owns that is a taxpayer of that country.
Right,
Mhm.
right. So you're bringing up all these points that just remind me of something else. And so another point that I find interesting is the responsibilities of the state of design authority as opposed to the responsibilities of a certification uh, state of or state's authority. So in other words, for like we use the example of Bombardier product is Transport Canada State of Design.
Mhm.
So there are obligations of the State of Design that go beyond what, say, the FAA would have as a responsibility in issuing their own state of type certification. Because my understanding is there are requirements that the State of Design are responsible for instance, supporting the application of a foreign validation, the issuance of a State of Design. Tripping all over myself here. It gets a little intricate, right? But for a foreign authority to accept the type certification, like you say, they may accept it or they may issue their own, or it may be a formal acceptance. I mean, there are a couple different ways they can do it, right? But nonetheless, they can't do any of that unless they first have the State of Design's support in supporting that project. Is that not right?
Yeah, completely. And that's why, the gateway to the world for any product is through that National Civil Aviation Authority. And exactly, maybe the word vouch isn't the right word, but it's like, they have to support that activity, that design approval that they did. The validation is, when you look at a foreign authority doing a validation, it's of that National Civil Aviation Authority's approval. So that's why, the effort is often a lot smaller. It's a subset. Again, they look at maybe particular areas of interest to them, requirements. For Canada, an area of interest is always cold soak. The other authorities don't have cold soak. So if a product is going to be foreign validated into Canada, well, that's pretty much an area that is always going to be looked at. But FAA, EASA, C.A.C, DGCA, they have particular requirements as well that are maybe not part of the initial certification of that product wherever its jurisdiction is. But then you have to be prepared to, well, how do I then address that? How do I then address that? That's that state's specific requirements, and that's
Right.
where that part of the paper airplane process
Mhm.
comes in. When I was talking about the DACA, the definition of certified aircraft, and you would say, okay, if I'm going to export my product to this jurisdiction, well, this is what its configuration looks like. If I'm going to go to this jurisdiction, this is what its configuration looks like, and I must have this thing on it, or I cannot have this thing on it. Every jurisdiction is just a little bit different. But yeah, those are all considerations that have to be, I guess, that everyone has to be aware of.
Yeah, yeah, and that's the reason we brought up this topic, because it affects aircraft management, the airworthiness organizations, and the operators. So, if you want to transfer, to change the type certificate data sheet from, for example, FAA to EASA, or you want to import an aircraft or export an aircraft, you have to consider these things. That there might be some differences between an FAA TCDS and EASA TCDS, and you have to take that into consideration. So this is the practical part for us.
Yeah, I mean, as a practical example, we know a client right now that is importing a Falcon 900 into Canada, and Canada is the only country in the world where they have to have number 2 engine rotor burst. It's like a metal plate. It protects the hydraulic lines from being sheared if you have a rotor burst number 2 engine. But nonetheless, they've got to go through this exercise. Now, I've done this myself with Falcon 900, and it's an exercise. And there are different ways around it. I mean, you can get a limited time exemption under certain circumstances, whatever. But for me, the key of this is, in this particular instance, the client bought the aircraft fully intending to import it into Canada and start operating on a certain date.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't just get the parts and have them installed. It's a much bigger deal, right? So this is where you really have to take into considerations like this when importing an aircraft. I mean, it's not just that, okay, it was built and it meets now. If the rules change between now and when you import the aircraft, for instance, a Boeing 737 MAX used to be allowed into EASA land pretty much at face value, but after obviously the incidents that have happened, that's no longer the case, right? They've done their own review and they've implemented their own requirements over and above the State Designs type certification. So, like you say, it's something you have to be aware of, right?
Yeah, and the people who are operating these aircraft, they don't necessarily know, and generally it's not them themselves. They have a whole organization around them, and that's part of the thing. And what I would hope that they do is, especially clients who have these very expensive business aircraft, for example, or if, even large commercial airliners, if you have fleets of aircraft coming in, it's like someone's hopefully giving them that advice. I mean, you're paying for them for a reason. That's like, yeah, absolutely, we can do this, but here's what it's going to take. Here's the effort. If I have to do a mod, what that means, how we have to go about getting that approval. And all of this, it takes time and takes money.
Yeah, yeah.
And things can't be done in a day. And one thing I always tell my students is, we have the confidence in the civil aviation system because of the rigor, because of the processes, because of the um, the high regulations, the high bar that has to be met. So if you're going to get into that business, or if you're going to be buying one of these kind of products, you should really understand the state of affairs, that those
It-
kind of things are necessary.
Yeah, this is exactly what we deal with. Our book about managing aircraft, we talk about how it managing an aircraft is not a one-man show. I mean, we see a lot of small aviation departments where they have a couple pilots, maybe a mechanic, and that's about the extent of it. But you have to not it's quite unusual where one person can manage all of that. There are different aspects that have to be considered, and the experience comes into it. And this is part of what we're trying to produce here is to make the different perspectives of different groups. I mean, we want to look at all kinds of perspectives, right down to ground handlers and certification experts. But you at least need a sense of how everything fits together, because, like you say, you don't know what you don't know. But if you at least have an idea that, oh, wait a minute, I think there was something in this area that we should have a closer look at least maybe you have the idea that you should get somebody's input from somebody that might know that area, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're completely right. I mean, you guys, you have an expertise, and exactly, if you're going to be doing, this kind of importation or whatever, you want to make sure you have someone on the ground who knows what it's going to take. Because you're right, some of the organizations that, or not even organizations, but I guess people that support, these operators, yeah, just a couple of people, but they don't see that whole process, and then all of a sudden it becomes a surprise, and then it becomes, wait, what do you mean it's going to take me this long, it's going to cost me this much money?
Yeah.
It's kind of almost like you want to arm yourself with the best resources possible when you're going into that situation, that new market, or to do that reg flip, or whatever it is. You want to have the expertise to know, and sometimes, yeah, people, they just don't know. So
Mhm.
hopefully the work that you do and other organizations out there, it helps spread that word, and people can think of things from a different perspective.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, we just hate seeing people trip all over themselves or cause themselves more grief than necessary, you know?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
yeah. Yes, and like I said, or maybe I didn't say it here, but what in my past life, we'd see it, you're going to do a foreign validation in a certain country. Some of the countries, they have application fees. Not just that the work of the authority is taxpayer funded, but depending on the weight of your aircraft, the size of your aircraft, there might be importation fees. Then there's the fee of the OEM to do the work with the national authority. So you put together the estimate, and the individual just bought a 70 or $80 million airplane, and they're like, what do you mean it's going to cost 20,000 or $50,000 or whatever it's going to cost me? Because they didn't know that there was going to be a charge to the
Yeah.
authority because of the authority, or the man hours that it was going to take to do the work. And then they go, then I don't want the registration. Oh, okay, that's your choice. Right?
Well, yeah, and it's interesting because some of these people that you deal with, and Lisa had a client, they just bought a $60 million airplane. And then they came to her and they wanted a maintenance program. I think it was a maintenance program, but she gives them a quote and they're like, well, that's a lot. Can you like do it for half that? Because we're only going to have the aircraft on the register for like 6 months. Well, 4 years later, the aircraft's still on the register, and there is no doing things halfway in aviation, right? So
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, no, completely right. And it costs what it costs. I mean,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter if it's for 1 day or for 1 year. That's the effort.
exactly.
Yeah, it was funny because they were asking kind of a discounted manual, not in terms of price, but in terms of the manual itself. And I was, what
Can you just
exactly
take,
am I going to take out? I'm not sure. I mean,
but see that tells you right there. It's that they don't know. It's like, no, I
Yeah,
can't just take
exactly.
stuff out of the manual. It's there for a reason. You can't not do it.
yeah, I mean, you're not going to get approved because the things that are in the manual are the things that the authority wants to see. So,
Well,
which
a
one?
whole aspect of this that I think a lot of people don't grasp is these are standards. They're minimum standards. And the reasons for the standards are what I always refer to as the least common denominator. There will always be somebody in industry that doesn't want to do even the minimum. So you have to at least put in a minimum. So if I sell my aircraft to you or I buy somebody else's aircraft, I can at least look, there should be a baseline in place as far as the standard that aircraft meets or what it's designed to, or whatever the case might be, right? And without those, I mean, there will always be somebody that's trying to skirt it, right? So
Yeah. So coming back briefly to the change in TCDS. So we were talking about we have a Bombardier product, so it has a Transport Canada TCDS, and I want to export it to EASA. And they don't have it, so they have to go through their process and come up with their own TCDS. So I suppose the Bombardier would be the one who is going to give all the information to EASA in order for them to make their own evaluation.
Yeah, it really depends. Like being in Canada, and because the relationship with Transport Canada, FAA, and EASA, the three organizations, the certification and validation, they often happen very quickly within each other, regardless of who the applicant is. So, in case of a Canadian applicant, the EASA type certification will often happen relatively quickly in aviation terms, a couple months down the road after the Transport Canada certification. But let's say you did have a Canadian let's say you did have a Canadian product, whether it was whatever foreign authority, exactly. It's like, okay, well now, let's say we didn't have that relationship with EASA, then yeah, we'd have to, the applicant would have to prepare an application package. Transport Canada would send it, and then EASA would need to then determine, okay, what would the level of effort and involvement be in this product, seeing as Transport Canada certified. And then again, exactly, the OEM is going to have to support that information. There's, going to be different levels of briefings, likely visits, across the pond. There's probably going to be specialist reviews on site. And then exactly, then, a TCDS is going to get drafted up. And then, it's going to get published. So, TCF and EASA right now, that really doesn't happen that way because they all kind of work in very closely with each other. But if we took another example like C.A.C, for example, in China, we have confirmed sale. Then okay, we do the application. The fee is paid by the applicant, and then Transport Canada in this case would act as the interlocutor between the applicant and the authority. And the authority would advise, okay, this is what we're going to need to be able to issue, a validated type certificate. And they're going to provide the list. You're going to ask for reports. They're going to ask for presentations. There could be a visit here, or the applicant and Transport Canada Support could be going over to their authority. That kind of thing happens, and that's why the process takes, especially with some of these larger foreign authorities, it could take, even not the TC, FA, even ANAC, the kind of group of four. It can take a year, 16 months, 18 months to work with some of the other authorities, and it's a lot of effort and time.
So I've had dealings with Bombardier before, and it's been my experience that when I gone to receive an aircraft on behalf of the authority, they have generally the FAA, Transport Canada, and EASA type certification documents available right then and there. So, but I've also done accepted aircraft from other type certificate holders that don't do that. Now, it was my understanding that that's because Bombardier, they have DOA approval or design organization approval from all three authorities. Is that right?
So I know Bombardier used to have an office in Europe that I believe had a DOA, but I don't think that's a determining factor. I think it's just, again, the level of which the product is working. So if you're the Boeings and the SOs and Bombardiers and Gulfstreams, there's kind of this these higher level working arrangements with all the authorities, even ANAC. We should include ANAC in this too in Brazil, because they've really, they're part of the big four, I guess. I guess that's because there's could be because there's other agreements in place. It could be because of the product that they're building. Part 25 aircraft are treated, perhaps treated a little bit differently than, rotorcraft or, Part 23 aircraft. But I think that's more of a company decision and kind of an alignment of the authorities, because, by no means is that absolutely required. You could do, in the case of a Canadian applicant, a Canadian approval, and then go do, finish that certification activity in 4 years, and then or 5 years, and then go do an FAA validation after. But it's advantageous, especially for Canadian applicants, because the markets are Europe and the United States, that it happens in quick succession. So you're completely correct. There's nothing saying that it has to be that way. It's more of a decision that if, especially for Canadian applicants, because if their major markets are those jurisdictions, then again, those jurisdictions would be more likely to work with them to get the products there. Because if you look at Canadian applicants, Canadian people who build products, and how many of those products actually stay in the country, it's like less than 10% of the product lines. The majority are going to FA or Europe, and then the remainder, and that's like, those two combined is like, 70% or 60%. So then you've got the 10% that stays in Canada, and then you've got the 20 or 30% that goes to the rest of the world. So, if an arrangement can be made, absolutely, you want to have, because it's to your benefit as an OEM to have those quick. If you're Gulfstream, have a quick Canadian and EASA approval thereafter, and if you're a Bombardier or a Viking or a Airbus Canada, then you want to have your product quickly validated by FAA and EASA, because your products are going to be going there most likely.
I guess for novel products, it might come back to what you were saying about having a sale arranged in the foreign authorities' jurisdiction as well, right?
That's the other thing too. Like, let's say you're doing a very large design change on one of these products. Well, you've already got hundreds of your products in that country, and then either you're just adding a service bulletin onto the product, or you have a new design, but maybe the type certificate didn't change. Maybe there was some amendment to the TCDS, but you still have the same model rating or same model number. Maybe just a marketing designation change. Exactly. Then from nothing changes from the foreign authorities' perspective. but they know, that, okay, well, there's be hundreds more of these aircraft with these modifications in our jurisdiction. So, it's, and because they know that their citizens are buying those products, then you kind of go a little bit further to the front of the line.
Right. Okay.
So you said two magic words, service bulletin. Can you explain what service bulletins are and how they come to be?
Sure. So service bulletins are a document, I like to call it like a vessel that takes previously approved data in some fashion, and is able to convey it out into the fleet. One thing people don't realize is that, you build a product and it goes out the door. Well, I have to maintain and configure and make sure that that product, and if I'm going to do design changes or if I need to do corrective actions, that fleet that's in service is going to be able to get those corrective action fixes or design change modifications that are going to make the product better, whatever the case may be. Well, how do I do that once the plane has left the factory? And I'm talking in an airplane context, but equally applicable to engines, rotorcraft, propellers. How am I going to make changes to those products, those aeronautical products, if it's already out there in the fleet and it's flying around? And the vehicle is the service bulletin, and it will contain the modification details of what the modification is, what has to be done to get set up to make the incorporation of the service bulletin, the accomplishment instructions for how you will actually carry out the activity, the parts that are necessary to carry out the installation of that fix or mod or corrective action, whatever it may be, onto the plane that's already in service, and then that document has to be signed off by an AME, an aircraft mechanic, that it indeed was incorporated, and then there's a binder that's going to go in. It's going to be stamped off and said that yes, this plane now incorporates this, and that vehicle, that vessel, that's a service bulletin that can actually carry physical changes to the aircraft, but it can also carry manual changes. So, maybe to do a certain functionality, I need a certain flight manual revision or certain flight manual change. Well, it would come with that flight manual procedure, and then that would also now become part of your essentially your operating manual.
A lot of service bulletins have a communication form where it is expected for the mechanic or the workings organization to fill out the form saying that the service bulletin has been incorporated and then sent to the TC holder. Would you like to comment on this? Because this is a small piece that, again, is another thing that people have a hard time getting why it is important.
Yeah, so I didn't see it that much on my side, but of course. So one thing people don't realize is that it's beneficial. Well, no, sorry. There's a couple different reasons. If I have a run-of-the-mill design change, it's up to the operator if they want to incorporate it or not. Where the rubber hits the road, though, is especially when you have a potential continuing airworthiness issue, potential safety issue, and a corrective action. The service bulletin being the vehicle, you need to know as the OEM who's incorporated what. Now, of course, you want to know who's incorporated what functionality because maybe people, some of these service bulletins are chargeable. Oh, I want to know how much money have we made from this specific design change being installed on an aircraft. So that form, it's going to get filled out and sent back to the OEM, and they're going to compile it at their customer support organization and say, okay, yeah, of the 1,000 airplanes we have flying out there, well, this mod, only 100 of the people, so it's only a 10% incorporation rate. Okay, maybe it wasn't as successful as we thought it would be. Or, oh no, this mod, look at this one. This is a 90% incorporation rate. Everybody wanted this mod. So you get a lot of good data from the field. But more importantly is the safety aspect. So you need to know who has what on their aircraft, because if something goes wrong, I need to know which aircraft have that. So it's all well and good to incorporate a design change through a service bulletin. But let's say there's becomes a potential issue with that that design, and there's a potential, continuing airworthiness investigation because of it. Well, I, as the OEM, want to know how many people incorporated this. So in this case, only 10% of the fleet. Okay, well then I have to deal with 100 aircraft. Or do all 1,000 have it? Or if there is a potential, safety concern at continuing airworthiness investigation, I need to know, is it a small amount that I could campaign that out? And I only have 100 aircraft, and I'm showing my authority that, look, the service bulletin is being taken up. We're getting the information back. It's being absorbed. The operators are taking it, or no, nobody's taking it, and the compliance time for this, was going to be 12 months, and we're in month number 8, and we're not seeing any pickup. Then it puts it on the authority to say, okay, well, now we might have to put an airworthiness directive on this, and they're going to AD it. So the form you're talking about is all about data, and we live and die by data. And the more data we have, the more informed decisions we can make. So when everything's working perfectly, it's just, it's good to know who has what. But when something goes wrong, you want to know who has what, because now you have to take appropriate action. And you need to know, hey, if I'm going to do a corrective action, does it affect my entire fleet? Does it only affect 100? Does it affect 500? Like, who does it affect? And I can only do that if I have the information. So that incorporation data for the service bulletin actually does become quite key.
Yeah.
Right. So if you, under the ICAO annexes, there's an obligation for type certificate holders to notify regulatory authorities of any potential issues, right? So this would be one mechanism that the type certificate holder would use to know who has what aircraft where and what authorities they need to be in touch with, right?
Correct. And in Canada, it's part of CAR 521 Division 8 type certificate holder responsibilities. It's the type certificate holder's responsibility to have a system in place to manage what they call SDR, service difficulty report. Right. So if there is a defect reported or a concern, then there needs to be a mechanism that those operators can get that information back to the OEM, and then it can be dispositioned. Is it a safety issue or not? Okay, not a safety issue, great. It's been addressed. We satisfy CAR 521, we're okay. But if it is a safety concern, then it has to enter the continuing airworthiness process, and it has to be investigated, and it has to be determined what and if an appropriate action would be. And that could culminate up to and including mandated action through an airworthiness directive.
Right. Okay. I'm curious. The mechanism for issuing a service bulletin. Now, service bulletins typically are considered approved data by the state of authority responsible for the registration of the aircraft. But they typically accept service bulletins. Like you say, it may be a physical change to the aircraft, it might be a software change, it might be a document change, right? But typically, the authority will simply accept a service bulletin as acceptable, or rather approved data. So what's the mechanism within the type certificate holder organization for approval of that data? Because for it to be considered authority approved data, I would expect that the mechanism has to be robust enough and formal within the organization.
So there's a slight nuance to that. In the regulatory framework, the service bulletin itself is what we call specified data. But what it does is it takes previously approved data and it conveys it out. So the actual approval of the data that goes into that service bulletin, yes, it would have to go through the certification process that we previously described, those 4 phases, whatever, I didn't elaborate on it too much because we talked about it from the type certification perspective, but I'm looking at the design change perspective. It's kind of a subset of that type certification perspective. We're still doing those steps. We're just not doing as thorough, you don't need, for example, you're doing a new product. Well, you have to, you're going to have a general familiarization or a technical familiarization. You have to have a new cert basis. If I'm doing a design change, most of those are not going to be necessary, right? So or less, again, of a certain scope unless we invoke CPR. But let's say we're not invoking a change that is going to require a new certification basis. You're still following those certification phases, and you're still having to approve that through whatever means is necessary. If you don't have a delegated organization, Transport Canada is going to have to do some approvals, or if you do have a delegated organization, maybe you're going to do the approval. But let's say, for example, you want to incorporate a flight manual, and that service bulletin is going to put it out. Well, that AFM, the actual content, has to be authority approved. In our case, Transport Canada would have to perform LOS, level of service, to approve that AFM change. Once that AFM change is approved, then they can say, okay, here's the service bulletin, here's what needs to be done, here's the approved data as part of that AFM package, and now you can now take that and put that into your flight manual on your aircraft. So the rigor still has to be done. You still have to go through the process, the certification process, the design change process. But in the end, once you get that approved data, then you're able to then have your internal sign-off processes for your service bulletin, and then that change can go out via the vessel, which is the service bulletin.
Okay, so certain authorities like the FAA, they have delegated people that can approve flight manual amendments.
Mm-hmm.
So if an OEM has a person so designated within their organization,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, technically it would be the FAA approval, but it would be an in-house mechanism where it's basically automatically bought off, right?
Yeah, again, there's still rigor. I mean, I don't want there to be a misconception that, there's no oversight, because even then, there are also OEMs that may not be able to fully approve AFM changes, or they might be able to approve AFM changes of certain scope, for example. Like, let's say,
Right.
Step numbering changes, or clerical or pagination issues, or, if you had a previously approved content, well, let's say it was a temporary revision, and now I want to formally incorporate that into my flight manual. Well, you already had that data approved. I don't need to go get Transport Canada approval again. The authorized person could approve that and put that in the flight manual. So yes, that is possible. But again, every company has an agreed process with their authority for how it gets approved. They follow that process, and the process is auditable. It's not like they go out, they approve it, and it's never seen again. Audits happen on a regular basis. There's self audits. There's the authority comes in and audits. And those are all auditable. So if an organization is found to not be following the agreed processes, then there could be a corrective action that's necessary, and up to and including, even if if it's repeated offenses or it continues, then the national authority could fine you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I have a comment on service bulletins, and I would like your take on it. So
Sure.
Years ago, I was doing a review for a company. They were doing a phasing of this aircraft, and there were a bunch of service bulletins that were optional, that were embodied in the aircraft, and they embodied, if I'm not mistaken, revision 1 of the service bulletin. But at that time, when I did the review, there was a service bulletin revision 2. And the revision 2 said that even if you had revision 1 embodied, you had to do certain changes that were reported in a service bulletin revision 2. So my point is that, sometimes operators think that is a good idea to embody optional service bulletins, and it might be, but my point is, make sure you have to understand that that service bulletin now is part of your aircraft configuration, and as such, it needs to be followed up, meaning that if you embody a revision 1 and now there is a revision 2, and revision 2 tells you that you have additional steps to do, you have to do it. Would you agree with this?
Oh, absolutely. Service bulletins get revised all the time, and they get signed off and sent out there. And you have to look at it, on its own. It's been approved. It stands on its own. And if it says, yeah, there's a delta that has to be performed from the previous revision, you have to satisfy that delta before that AME can stamp it off and say you've now satisfied it. This becomes ever more important when you have a service bulletin related to a design change because of a continuing corrective action, a continuing airworthiness issue, especially if it's an AD, because if I don't follow those steps, then I can't close that service bulletin, I can't close that AD, then I have a grounded aircraft.
Yeah.
Right. So, it's very important. They're there for a reason. The steps are there for a reason. It's very important to pay attention to what it's, the accomplishment instructions, what you're actually trying to get out of it.
Yeah.
I've seen another issue come up though, where, for instance, you have a radio receiver that has been modified to a certain level under a service bulletin, an optional service bulletin. Then another optional service bulletin comes out, and it specifies quite clearly that you don't have to do this additional change, but you can if you want. But then you have to send your radio out to the shop for repair. And it comes back with Rev 2 embodied, which is not compatible with the original revision. So it's something you have to actually, whoever's managing that has to pay attention to and specify specifically on the work order what it is you want done and what you expect back, including the rev status of whatever approved or specified data that you want it done to, right? So it's not common, but it does happen. I've seen it.
Yeah, no, you're completely right. And you don't want to be ever in a position where it's like, now I'm lost. I don't know. It's, it's not what I wanted it to be. It's not going to now work with what we want to do. Sometimes, there can be tunnel vision. It's like, oh, just do what it says and move along. But, yeah, you need to, in so far as each, document, it stands on its own, you also have to make sure, hey, this is also part of a larger system. And what is this interacting with? And is it going to be compatible, and am I still going to be able to do what I want to do? And if not, then you're right. If it's optional, then don't install it. I mean, there's no reason you have to.
No, and to my last point, the shops, they're obligated to maintain any product that they maintain to the latest standard, which would be the latest revision, unless otherwise specified. So that's where you have to really pay attention, and it can bite you. Yeah.
I have a question. I know we wanted to keep this for another time because we hope we are going to have a number of these interviews, because it's such a vast topic and there are so many things that we can talk about. But if you could briefly talk about the difference between a service bulletin and an STC.
Sure. So, I mean, an STC is, is a large change to a type certified product. That's why it's an STC, supplemental type certification, supplemental type certificate. Generally, something at that level, it's going to be large things like I'm installing, interiors in an aircraft, or a new galley, or a new avionics suite, or I want to put certain equipment on my product, or I want to do an STC because maybe I'm a certain type of engine, and now I want to go to, or maybe I'm a prop engine, but I want to go to a turboprop, or there's all kinds of different reasons why you could have an STC. Even smaller reasons, I want to incorporate a third. I don't want to go back to the OEM, but I want to install a third FMS, or third whatever insert avionics box here. I want to, you can do that by STC, and all that means is there's a rigor, there's a process, it's followed, an accepted type certification process, and now that organization is able to do that work, and get an approval. Again, going back, the service bulletin, on the other hand, is just taking approved data and repackaging it into what the issue is, what you're trying to accomplish, the actual accomplishment instructions, what equipment you need to make the change, and then as a package, and then you can install that as part of your aircraft. So, at a high level, the STC is doing all the data engineering work, getting the approval, following that certification process, those 4 phases we were talking about, to get an approval in the end, where you, instead of a type certificate in a TCDS, you're going to get a supplemental type certificate to slap on to your type certificate. Whereas the service bulletin is a mechanism to say, okay, this design change has been done, by an OEM, and I want to put that product out there onto the existing fleet, because I'm still building the product in production. Okay, we've now cut this in on the line, so from this serial number going forward, they have already incorporated this modification, but the rest of the fleet can benefit from it. So now take this document and you can incorporate all that work. But all the work that was done to get there was done as part of the design change process, so the type certification process at the OEM.
Okay.
Yeah, we spoke about this just briefly last time we talked, and about this one project that I had where an aircraft had a SATCOM system embodied under a limited supplemental type certificate. So this is serial number specific for the aircraft.
Yeah.
And the aircraft was then being exported to the FAA land, and the FAA had what the exporter thought was an equivalent service bulletin, and or pardon me, an equivalent supplemental type certificate. And so we asked them to show the exercise for equivalency, and in the end, they were sure it was, but in the end, they went away and they came back and they said, no, actually, it wasn't the same. There were a couple of very subtle differences, wiring changes and such. But in an exercise like that, it's important to understand that the two are different. And again, with different authorities, there may be a different standard being employed, and you have to go through the exercise of verifying that one is equivalent to the other, right?
Yeah, and a lot of people, they think, oh, type certification process, that's it, and I need to, all the other authorities, but they don't think, well, the STC process, well, they have to be validated too. They're just not, there could be, depending on size and scope, some automatic acceptance, but the majority, the authority can do a validation on an STC just like they would on a TC. So there can't be this presumption, oh, because it's in a small area or it's for one box or this specific thing, it's not going to garner any attention. Well, no, it still needs to be validated. The only thing that I can think of off the top of my head is like TSOs are reciprocally accepted amongst TCFA and EASA. But STCs are fully at capability to be validated. And then again, you have to kind of go through the same process. You need application package, you need the support from your national authority. You got to go through that effort. And that authority is going to look at whatever they need to look at.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't understand that when you embody an STC in an aircraft or any aeronautical product, that aeronautical product no longer meets original type. So you can no longer say that it conforms to type unless the supplemental conditions identified in the supplement are in conformance as well.
That's correct. Exactly. It's kind of like you're building, a cake, or that book is now expanding. Well, here's your original TC, and now I got this STC and that STC. This is now my configuration, and exactly, it has to be looked at.
Yeah. And under aircraft management point of view, a lot of people don't understand that all these STC come with their own instructions for continued airworthiness that has to go in the maintenance program for the aircraft. And now you have maybe additional flight manual supplements that must be in the original AFM. So there is a lot to it. I had some clients that come up, oh, we are going to install these and do that. Oh, wait.
Well, you had one client with a helicopter that embodied floats. And
a basket. It was a cargo basket, yeah.
And physically, everything was perfectly fine, except for in the AFM for the
cargo basket. Yeah.
It said could not be used with floats, but they'd already embodied both.
Yeah, but
Oh,
So
the yeah, because there was a helicopter that was going to be operated on a boat, so flotation devices were a requirement
yeah.
from a aviation for the civil aviation authority. So, but they wanted a cargo basket because they wanted to move stuff between the port and the vessel, but they were not compatible. So
See, that's interesting. I was just thinking as you were talking that, people don't realize. I mean, we touched on it a bit earlier though, but you've gone to this organization that's done that STC. They're the one now responsible. So if there's an issue with that, you know, um, that basket, or if there's a continuing airworthiness issue on that area, you're not going back to the OEM, you're going back to that
yeah,
STC holder, right? Now,
yeah.
again, maybe you need support back from the OEM, but again, that's going to be a commercial arrangement. But it is who is the holder, has responsibility for that area.
Yeah, and actually that brings to mind something else that I was involved in, and maybe it's just a commercial thing, but and you can tell me otherwise. But dealing with Boeing aircraft, I've had a couple situations where Boeing would refuse to perform a repair on a certain area of an aircraft that had an STC embodied that altered the original airframe. So, and I can understand why, because technically they wouldn't have the rights to the data to say what's been changed, right? So how can they, by rights, make a change to that? But so, what do you have anything on that?
Yeah, no, completely right. You don't want to make a change to something that you don't technically own now, or you're not responsible for because there's been a change to it, because now you become liable. So, and you're not going to do a change because I don't have the data. So I don't know what the full effect of this thing is. Now, again, if there's a commercial arrangement or it's a unique system or whatever the case is, that kind of thing happens all the time. But if you just happen to bring your airplane back to the factory and say, "Oh, I want you to fix this," you go, "Wait a minute, there's an STC here. I can't touch that," and they're well within the right to do so. And it makes sense, because now if something goes wrong, you're taking responsibility for it when it should be, again, that STC holder.
Right, right. But it's something a lot of people don't think about, and I think it's worth thinking over before you go and embody certain repairs or alterations, because particularly in an environment like the FAA world where they can do field approvals. So they've
Yes.
got designated representatives in the field that can come up with relatively cheap, as opposed to going to the OEM repair schemes.
Mhm.
But down the road, they could very well bite you.
Yeah, I haven't heard of much, but I have heard of stories over the years of exactly that. Because again, what is an airplane on the ground? It's a paperweight. It's not.
Yeah.
Airplanes are meant to be in the sky, either because they're making money, or whatever, whatever function they're carrying out. So it's perfectly fine to have a system like that, and yes, you want to repair it and you want to get the airplane back into service, but they don't. There could be ramifications down the road. That's why, when I look at Canada's Car 521, record keeping is a huge thing with type certificate holders. You always want to have good records, because if you don't have good records, then you just don't know what's happened or what's going on, and when you want to make a change later, you don't know what you're basing it off of.
Yeah.
I've never been in that position, but I can imagine it can get very messy.
Oh, for sure. And, I mean, there are a lot of different aspects that we could look at going down different avenues here. Another that comes to mind for me is just simply maintaining the aircraft. Coming at it from a maintenance perspective, I can't tell you how many times I've seen an aircraft have an STC embodied where the owner of the aircraft doesn't actually have a copy of the data that was used for the embodiment of that. I mean, technically, it's technical data that belongs in technical record of the aircraft.
Yeah.
But in the end, if you don't, if whoever's taking care of the aircraft doesn't make sure that it's in the package, the work package of when it was embodied, now when it comes time to go perform maintenance on that system, it could be wiring changes, it could be anything. But if you don't have that data, you're lost. You can't maintain that aircraft in a safe condition.
Exactly. And Yeah, and to see that happen to to an airplane, that's like sacrilege, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's almost always a solution. Thing is that
Yeah,
anything can be done with time and money, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's-
yeah, you're completely right. Yeah.
the thing is, you buy a $60 million airplane and tell the owner that he can't fly it because you didn't do your job. Yeah, good luck.
It's not gonna be
Yeah.
No, you're
So,
completely right too. Exactly. And that's why, these organizations that, build these products, and again, whether it's private, whether it's commercial, these are big ticket items, the people who buy them, the airlines or private operators or even fleet operators. Yeah, like
That kind of
NetJets,
thing.
like fractional, that's what they fractional ownership.
fractional, right?
Fractional
Right.
ownership. Um, you know, they're buying a lot of your product. Your organization, when they come calling, you have a team of people to support because they bought 50 or 100 aircraft and they're flying, these fleets, right? So
Mhm.
Hey, in regards to support, I've been lucky enough to be maintaining brand new aircraft before, and I've had the service representative come by, and we've had what we considered pretty significant issues with the avionics, different um, panels dropping right offline and such.
mm,
And the service rep would usually go, "Oh, geez, I haven't seen that before." But then about 3, 4 months later, there's a service bulletin out, and they say, "Oh, yeah, there's been a history for a while."
mhm.
Like, how does that happen?
These organizations are large organizations, and sometimes it can be the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing.
Mhm.
Sometimes you would think field service reps or these kind of tiger teams that are going out and they're dealing with these, potential AOGs or whatever you have, that they'd be all in the know, but maybe they don't, and or maybe that specific team or maybe that specific rep hasn't seen it, or maybe they just didn't want to say. And but these teams, that information always goes back, and then they always do a review, and then yeah, maybe they hadn't, or maybe not that group, but they there was something going on in the
Mm,
background, and then because unless it's like an immediate safety concern, it has to be a corrective action or something like that. These things can, product improvements or whatever, as long as there's no um, safety concern, the development of those design changes could take months, right? So and there
yeah,
you go. A few months down the road, they go, oh look, here comes a fix. Maybe
right.
you knew, maybe you didn't know. I don't know. You would like to think that these teams know, but sometimes, like I said, we get tunnel vision. They're only looking at their
Mm,
small little area, but all that information and data, the more data you have, the more empowered you are. It goes
right.
back, and they're able to put that through the system and go, oh yeah, no, we can fix that, and then they come up with a fix.
Mhm,
Mhm.
mhm.
So we touched on this a little bit when you were talking about service bulletins. For operators and aircraft management company, can you spend a few words on why it is important to report issues to the TC holder?
Like I was saying, our strength is the data. When I say our, I should correct that. The applicants or the OEMs or the TC holders,
Collectively,
strength is the data.
Yeah.
Collectively, yeah, yeah, as a group. Um, uh, you know, data is important, and if you don't know who's doing what on what aircraft, um, you have a blind spot. So it's very important for there to be good communication. It's very important that once the service bulletin's incorporated, the accomplishment summary or communication sheet is sent back, so and then really what it is to prepare you for when you have a problem, because it's not that you're not going to have a problem. There's going to be a problem eventually. You cannot never have any problems. I mean, that would be amazing, right? But then half the aviation world would be out of business, right?
Yeah.
But the goal is okay. We want to make sure that we have information and we want to be ready. We want to have the data necessary that if something happens, when it happens, that we are able to quickly understand the status of our fleet and who's embodied what and where are we sitting. And then that can judge, okay, next steps. If I have a corrective action that needs to go out, like I said before, is it 100 aircraft or is it 1,000 aircraft? That's a very different exercise, right? So, you know, data is power, I guess. Knowledge is power.
It is, and I think a lot of people don't understand the importance of it, but also there are liability attached to not sharing data as well. I mean, excuse me. For instance, service difficulty reports have to be reported to type certificate holder, but when you have occurrence reports that have to go to the regulator, if you don't report these things, but you know something happened, for instance, if you have an aircraft that had a system that failed, but it never made its way into the logbook, and the OEM, the TC holder, was never advised, they can't be held liable. But if you make them aware of it and nothing was done, that changes the story.
Exactly. Yeah. And again, it's not a game of hot potato. Like, nobody wants to be the one holding the hot potato, but also there's processes and procedures, and you want visibility for a reason. And exactly, you know, if you're not sending in that I completed this work, or I signed it off, or, you know, or not, yeah, hey, when I have a problem, I'm not reporting it. Exactly. Then someone's going to come at you and go, well, why didn't you do that? But if you reported it, now, okay, you know, per our CAR 521 here in Canada, well, it's the type certificate holder's responsibility to do the investigation. So if it's on the TC aircraft or aeronautical product, okay, well, then they have their system and they go through the process and they determine what it is. If it's an area that's on an STC, well, they're the holder and they're going to do the investigation.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think it's just so important to remember that, because a lot of these things, like from a maintenance perspective, I've worked with different authorities, different organizations over the years under different regulatory regimes, and the one thing that's common is there are differences amongst each, and so the FAA, for instance, an A&P license holder has different privileges than a Transport Canada AME license holder versus an EASA AME license holder. So those privileges, they're in some cases subtle differences, in other cases there are big differences. But the one thing that I think we have to understand as maintainers is that certification decisions they're above us. Like, we should all have a good understanding of, okay, I've reached the level of my knowledge, of my expertise, of what I'm allowed to do. Even if you think you know better, even if you've experienced that you've had all kinds of interactions with certification, it may be it's not your decision to make. And it's important that these things need to be handled by certification or the regulator, or whatever the case might be. But if you take it on yourself, you're potentially endangering the aircraft and assuming liability, you know. So it's very important.
Yeah, you know, understanding roles and responsibilities is very important. You don't want to be taking on a liability that isn't yours, but also you want to be making sure that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, and you're supporting the product in the way that you check all the boxes, and you know you're doing your job, you know, efficiently. Yeah, absolutely. There are things that are going to be above, you know, that are going to come down the pipe because, yeah, the company has decided they want to do this certification project, or they want to do this design change, or this new AFM supplement, or whatever they want to do. And it's, you know, once you know it's coming down the pipe, then it's like, okay, well, then how does that now affect the work that I'm going to be doing? Is it going to change anything? It's kind of asking those critical questions. Never assume. Never assume.
No, never.
Yeah, we see this a lot in aircraft management because different regulatory regimes, like Brett was saying, they have different setup. Maybe, you know, you have to have a continual airworthiness organization. In other, you don't. You have the technician that is doing everything. But we always say, be careful that you understand the requirements and you understand your contract and your responsibilities, because those two are very important. Because again, like you guys were saying, the risk is that you're going to take on yourself more than you should. So
and you may unwittingly induce some sort of danger.
Yeah, for sure. So we're getting close to the end of our interview. So what do you wish you knew about aviation and your job that nobody told you? If there is anything.
Very vague. I would say, okay, kind of at large, how tough it would be. You know, um, you kind of go through university, and that's tough, but you don't really know until you don't know what you don't know. I say that phrase a lot, by the way, but it's true. And it's like, once I got into it, yes, I loved it, but man, it was really challenging. Um, but personally, I like challenge. I want to be challenged. I want to do something new. I want to find a way to um, use my talents and help. And I coach and mentor young engineers, or teach, or do whatever. But it's funny, in my interview for my very first job in certification, um, the manager who mentored me, he said, it's a mile wide and it's a mile deep. The breadth of information is so vast, and I didn't really appreciate it in the interview. But when I got the job, I realized, wow, there really is. And I talk to people, and they go, I've never heard of airworthiness, or I've never heard of certification, because maybe they're working in a small little part of the engineering world, or this little part or that little part. But really, when you do get to see the breadth and the width of the industry, you really realize, it's a lot, and you do have to be dedicated, and you also have to realize that you're not going to know everything, and it's okay not to know everything. And I think, as good engineers, you know, it's um, it's okay to say, you know what, I don't know, but I can go and find that information, or I'm going to go research it, or I'm going to find it out, or I'm going to go talk to people who can help me. And you know what? It's a life learning process too. You never stop learning. I learn something new every day, even though I've been doing this now, you know, aviation, at least for 15 years. Um, but, um, but I think that was it. I think when I heard the breadth and the depth, and you know, yeah, I didn't appreciate it until I got into it, and I go, oh, it's really, there are parts of aviation that I've never even touched, and I may never touch, and that's okay. But that's why there's an industry, because maybe that's someone else's expertise. um, and it's okay to be challenged too. But one thing I've gotten very comfortable with is change, and you have to be able to roll with it.
A very interesting answer. Thank you.
And you said it was tough. Well, that's on you.
Well, you know what? Just as a next step, I can say, well, it got easier because I liked it and I was
Right,
able to do
Yeah.
it better. So
Sure.
even now there were still challenges, but it was kind of that base that helped build on the skills, and then you're able to perform at a higher level, and then you get other projects, and you get exposed to other areas. And while it may be tough work, you can get through it, because you have you have a basis to do it with.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have to be passionate to be in aviation, because I agree. Sometimes it's tough, in particular at the beginning. It's a lot of responsibilities, a lot of difficult things that you go through, depending on your what you want to do in aviation. But yeah, I like your answer, anyways.
Just to
Uh,
add one just to add
yeah.
one thing, I being a professional engineer too, I see my responsibility, even though the federal framework is different. You don't need to be a PN to work in aviation. But that also, that kind of profound understanding of the safety of the flying public, that's a lot on someone's shoulders. And again, I have my little small part of the world, you have yours, other people have theirs. The only thing I can, I guess, say to that is just, I do my best job possible. And I remember kind of that oath that I took as an engineer, and I try to make sure that everything that I do, I always think about what what could happen,
Mhm.
and that helps keeps things in perspective.
What is or are the issues that you see in aviation nowadays, and what do you think is needed to solve them, in particular in your niche?
Um, I kind of touched on it a bit before. A lot of people don't know, like, they know you have to deal with an authority, but they don't know what certification is. And I talked to many people, especially in my past life, and they didn't even know that my department existed, Um, and I think regulatory affairs, aircraft certification, processes and procedures, some people just see it as kind of a black box. They don't kind of understand what it is, or they put it out of mind. Um, so at least in my field, I think, an awareness, understanding where it comes from. I mean, helping, or teaching a course that helps educate the next generation of engineers about, hey, there is this field out there, of work, that happens. And I think that's very important. Um, you know, Processes and procedures sometimes are not the flashiest things, but what I always say is that you know, we have a safe system, we have a robust system because of those processes and procedures. So you should know what they are.
Yeah, well
Sure.
said. Yeah. What do you enjoy the most about aviation and your job?
Honestly, the people. You touched on it before. I think people who are in aviation are unique people. some
Hmm.
some would say maybe not, some would say maybe gluttons for punishment, but definitely dedicated. They love what they do. They love aviation, not just airplanes, but can be anything. They're here because they really like it. They're dedicated, hardworking people. People I work with at Bombardier, even now at Transport Canada, some of the hardest working people that I've ever met. And then you kind of start to reflect on yourself, and you're like, man, maybe I should work harder. Or, am I meeting the expectations of my managers, and you know but I think the people and their dedication, I think, um, it really makes a difference. I also like, and maybe unique to me, my ability to coach and mentor, and be part of groups, and share my knowledge and expertise, because I have been around a while. That I like to do too. There's always the day job, there's always the doing the churn of the work. But I think, my favorite parts of the job are definitely liaising with people, liaising with the applicants, the other authorities, and being able to share my knowledge, and have conversations like this,
Yeah.
where it's like, yeah, we're speaking the same language, and you
Exactly.
get it, and it's very satisfying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I totally agree.
Yeah, you've been around 40 plus years, so you
Yeah.
had your share of people.
Yeah. And I would wish I could say that everything was amiable, but sometimes it's not,
No,
it's the
well,
way it goes.
There are challenges in everything, but like I said earlier,
yeah,
that's
Well,
skill too. That's a skill too.
yeah,
that's
it
exactly it.
is.
Like I, I shouldn't say that some interactions were not amiable. They were challenging, and
Hmm.
that's one thing I like what you said, that you got into it because it was challenging. This has always been challenging. It's always something new. Never the same thing the next day.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's
Very
great for
true.
somebody that likes challenge and doesn't like to get stale with things. This is definitely
Hmm.
an industry.
Oh, yeah.
An
Yeah,
industry
for
for
sure.
you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah. So, how do you see aviation evolving, in particular your niche?
Um, there are always going to be process and procedure updates, but maybe I can expand on kind of your question a little bit more. Um, that stuff will come out of, I think, the drives of the industry. I think that there's always a drive to go higher, faster, and further. We see it with, the potential reemergence of, supersonic travel. There's the urban air mobility, flying taxis and remotely piloted systems. There's even interest in airships again. So I think out of industry's innovation and evolution and drive to do these different things, and some of these are also, governments are putting money behind, and private industry as well, because of the environmental impacts, looking at eVTOLs, battery power, solar power, and these kind of things. I think that will drive, actually I know it will drive, there eventually will have to be regulatory updates for these. Will these products be able to use some of the existing regulatory framework? Will they be special conditions? Will they, there's a variety of mechanisms within the aircraft, certification process. But I think that industry evolution is going to then, is going to drive the authorities to, to have to look at, standards and how we're going to certify these products, either again or for the first time.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It's going to be interesting to watch.
be.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Do you have any advice for those starting out in aviation and in your field?
I would say, kind of along what we were talking about before, be open to advice, stay engaged, be engaged, ask questions. It's okay to say, I don't know, but don't just leave it there. Follow up with, but how can I find out? Or what can I do? Or who can I talk to? Life, I look at it as, learning is a lifelong thing. But that's probably the biggest thing. Aviation in Canada, it is difficult to get into. It took me 3 years after graduating, and I did my master's, and then I got an internship. I did my project management, and then I was able to get an internship, and I was able to make it work. But if you're not dedicated 100%, if you're not engaged, if you're not willing to put in the time or effort, then it's really going to be a challenge. So um, if you want to get into it, those are those things that you have to meet. And once you get into the field, I think the most important thing is learn. Don't be afraid to ask questions, and get engaged, and ask people, well, why does that work that way, or why is it this way? And over time you start to pick up all these things. The way I describe myself, I'm not an expert in one particular area of engineering. I consider myself kind of a generalist, or yes, I might be I have a certification expertise, but if we're having a discussion about engines, or we're having a discussion about aircraft performance or whatever, I might not be the expert, but I know what's going on, and I think that's a good place to be.
Yeah.
I think that's a
For
good place
sure.
to be. You don't have to necessarily be the expert, but at least be able to go, okay, no, I know what's going on, or I can contribute in some way. Then you contribute.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Anything that you would like to add?
No, I have a few topics that I kind of wish we would have touched on, but I'm sure we'll come back to those later on.
Yeah.
But-
Adam, I know you are on LinkedIn, so can we share your LinkedIn page with the viewers? And
Absolutely.
I don't know if you have a blog, or you want to share any other contacts, your teaching or other.
Well, yeah, absolutely. You can find me on LinkedIn. Always happy to have certification discussions. I teach January to end of April at Toronto Metropolitan University, so you can find me there, usually roaming the halls of the engineering building on Monday nights. Otherwise, yeah, I'm, because of my job, I'm traveling here or there. I'm up in Ottawa, or I'm at the applicant, or in the office here. Even though my job is based out of Ottawa, I'm here at 4900 Yonge Street in Toronto. And in Ottawa, we're the office is in Nepean, just the suburbs of Ottawa. but yeah, by all means, I'm always looking to make contacts and people to reach out and have good, thoughtful discussions.
Well, Adam, this has been great. Really, a lot of information to digest, but it was really, really good conversation. Thank you so much for your time. We really
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Yes,
It's my
thank you very much.
pleasure.
Appreciate it.
Thank you to you both for all the hard work that you're doing and giving a platform to people in the aviation community. And sharing amongst professionals. I really appreciate the opportunity and hope to do it again.
Of course,
Sure.
for sure. Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye
you.
now.
Bye now.